Hey guys, it's Matt, welcome to Speed Tutor, and today I'm going to show you how to create a radio or an audio based system where you have the name of the music you can play, you can pause, you can stop, you can skip between tracks, you can set the volume of the tracks, you can fade in and out between each of the tracks, and I will show you how to use multiple tracks, scriptable objects to have the name of each of your actual tracks and be able to use that to display at the bottom of our system. So I'll show you everything that you need today. Be sure to throw a like on the video, and all of this stuff will be uploaded to my Patreon so you can get all of the sprites, and you can check out and support me on Patreon to get access to all the scripts, all the entire project, particles, sprites, and so much more. To get us started, I'm just using the high quality PBR Old Retro Radio Free, which you can find on the Unity Asset Store, and I'll leave a link in the description. And I've just imported that into my scene. I've got my Speed Tutor test scene, which you can also find on the Unity Asset Store for free. And I've just positioned my camera in front of my object that I've got. And we're going to create a UI around it, just so that we can control the different things that happen. I've got a bunch of sprites, which I will provide on my Patreon, but all I've got is different ones for different buttons. So a triangle for a play button, pause button, stop button, a rectangle for the volume, and a left and right button, but these are not relevant. You don't need these, they can just be anything in the buttons. And I've got just a bunch of audio clips, and I'll provide these too, but these can be any audios. This is just to sort of showcase the example. So what we want to do to start off with, to create the UI to start with, we'll go right click UI and choose canvas. And I'm just going to name this to my radio canvas, and then I'm going to right click my radio canvas, choose UI, and then I'm just going to make a button, and you'll see it down here. So we'll go to 2D mode now. I will go and press F to zoom into my button, and you can see it, here in the workspace. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make my button square. I'll make it 150 by 150, so we've got something like this, and I'll just drag it to the right hand side of my radio, as you can see down at the bottom. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the text. I'm going to right click the button, choose UI, and choose image. Then when I've created the play button, I'll set the image that we've just created to 100 by 100, and I'll just add the play button sprite as long as you've got it and you select it and it's a 2D sprite and UI. Now we want a few duplicates, one for the play, pause, and stop. And then we'll be able to program those in. So we'll duplicate with Control D, pull this down below the other, and then duplicate again, and we'll do the same thing. Now we've got these like this. I will have my second one as the pause button, and then the third as the stop button. So what I'm going to do with the pause, as you might expect, select the image, and I'm just going to add my pause sprite, and on the stop button, add the stop image. And now we've got our buttons that look something like this. What I like to do is be able to control it with a vertical layout, so they're all evenly spaced. So what we can do is we can right click the radio canvas, choose UI, and I'm just going to choose to make a panel. And a panel would be just encapsulate the whole thing, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this panel down so it just covers all of our buttons, like so. You can see, because it'll highlight in orange when we find the edge. So this is the size I realistically want them to be. Now I'm going to bring this to the top of the stack here, and I'm just going to parent all my buttons to the panel. I'm going to select the panel and get rid of the image because I don't actually want to see anything. It's just going to act as my empty game object just to control them. And I'm just going to call this my main vertical buttons. And then what I'll do is an add component called a vertical layout group. And now you can see that it just shoved them up. And if I put these child alignment on middle, it will just mean that they're all centered evenly across all of the different sections that they have. So if I move this parent around, then they will all come in the exact right spacing that I would want. Is on my radio that I've got in the game, if we see it here, I'm just going to add an audio source to that object, because that is going to play our audio. Or you could have that on a different game object that's just one by itself. It's entirely up to you. And I don't want anything on play on awake or loop. We'll just leave everything by default at the moment. So we'll right click in the project, create C# script, and we're just going to call this our radio controller. And we'll open up in Visual Studio and we'll get rid of our starting methods. And what we're going to do here is be able to control what our play, pause, and stop button will actually do. To start with, you need to control your audio source that you have, and how do we do that? So, seeing as though this script is going to go on the object which has the audio source, we can just say private audio source, and then just call this, it's going to be the radio audio source with a semicolon. We're going to avoid start, and then what we're going to do is we're going to say that radio audio source equals get component, and then in 2 angle brackets facing away from each other, we'll just write audio source in here. So we'll find the game object that we're going to reference into this variable, so we don't have to add it to the inspector. So now we need to add what our play, pause, and stop logic is going to be. We're going to create a public method, so public void play audio, and this is what the play button will do. And what this is going to do is our radio audio source will say .play with 2 brackets and a semicolon. It just plays the method within the audio source to play whatever track we've given to it at any one point. Then similar with pause, we can do public void pause audio, and we can do radio audio source .pause, which does a similar thing to stop, but it pauses it at the time you've paused it, and when you press play it will resume from that position, rather than stop will actually stop it altogether and you'll have to restart it from the beginning. And again, as you might be able to guess, we can say public void stop audio as a new method, because we're going to use these as different button events. We can say the radio audio source .stop. So we can save that out now, go back into Unity, select on my radio, add the radio controller here, and you can see that nothing needs to happen at the moment. We can select our play button, and in the on-click event, we can add our radio, which would have our radio controller script. We can add and select the radio controller script here, and say that this button is going to be play audio. The pause button is going to have a new event, drag the radio onto it, select the script that we want, which is the radio controller, and have this as pause our audio. And then the stop is we can add a new event, radio controller, and stop our audio. It won't play anything because we haven't specified what music it should play. So for this example, we can just click on the audio source now, go to an audio track, and select one, and we'll just add it to the audio source from now. And it doesn't have play on awake, so it wouldn't play at the start. So now when we press start, you can see that we've got the buttons, and now we can press play and the music will start. We can pause it and it will go away. We can press play again and it will start from the point that it was. We can stop, and then we can press play to restart the actual audio. And now we're going to create the bottom section of the UI, which will be the bit which will control the skipping and the name of the audio. And then we'll also talk about adding multiple audio tracks which you can skip through. So we'll make the UI first. We'll go back onto our canvas. I'm just going to grab myself the play button from the main folder that we had. I'll drag that out, and I'm just going to put that below my radio here, and I'm just going to rename this to my backwards button. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my sprites folder and go into the backwards button, select the image, and add the arrow which goes left. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate that button, bring that up further up, and then I'm going to just keep this in line, bring it across to the other side of my radio, and I'm just going to call this the forward button, and then I'll open that up and add the right arrow. Then what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to have a button here, I'm just going to have some text, and what I'm going to do this time is just duplicate the forward button, put it in between the 2 buttons that we've already created, and just call this our track text. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that in between them. I'm going to scale the main button out. I'm going to get rid of the image in the middle. I'm going to click on the actual track text, get rid of the button component because I don't want it to act like a button anymore. It can be an image because I can keep the background the same, but I'm going to right click that, choose UI, and then choose text. And now I'm going to expand this text by holding Alt using the anchor and expand out. I'm going to set it back to the middle again. Then what I will do is I will just say this is our track name. Then I'm going to centralize it, and centralize. I will make the text color white so we can actually see it, make that bold so it becomes visible, and you can use Text Mesh Pro if you want to, and I'll just have the track name. Now what we can do with this, similar to how we did the main vertical buttons, we can right click, UI and panel, and I'm just going to call this main horizontal buttons, and then I'm going to scale that panel down by dragging it around the current size of the buttons that I have, because that's realistically the size that I wanted. And then I'm going to get rid of the image component. I'm going to drag this above them and make sure that when you have objects that you want to be arranged by either horizontal or vertical, you have them in the order that you want them to be arranged in the hierarchy. So now I'm going to parent them as children of this main object, and then I'm going to have the horizontal layout. Then when I add center middle, then they're perfectly centered. We need to fill this in. We need to hold some information about our tracks and have each track have a different name. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a really simple scriptable object, which a scriptable object just holds data about anything that you want, and this is really useful for you to use. So right click in your project panel and choose C#, and we're just going to name this track. So track can be just one track of audio. So I'm going to open that up in Visual Studio. I'm going to get rid of the starting methods here, and then in this case I'm just going to say public audio clip, because this is just one audio clip, and then it's going to be the track audio clip, and really that's all our scriptable object is going to hold. The information is just one audio clip which we're going to specify. It doesn't act as a default Unity class. We don't need to inherit from mono behavior. We're actually going to call this a scriptable object. And now this can exist in our project panel, and it exists as many objects as we want to hold information about, and we can use them when we need. And you do need to create something so you can create your own scriptable objects as like little prefabs almost. So in square brackets above your public class, you can just say create asset menu, and then in brackets you can just say file name, and it'll just autocomplete before you. So file name is a lowercase f with a capital N. Then you can just call this whatever you want your thing that you're going to create. So I'm just going to call this track. So that's the name of the file. And I'm just going to minimize this. And you can see I already have a folder called scriptable objects. And now if I right click, create, I've got something called track. And that's the name that we gave to it. So if I click track and I just call this music track 1, you can see when we click on music track 1, it's got the track audio clip, and it's got a space for an audio clip. So in this instance, we want to add a particular audio. So say I've got this one, which is C by Alex Productions. I can copy the name of this. I can go to my music track 1. I'm going to rename this to that, but I'll get rid of the no copyright sound. So this is the name of our current scriptable object. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to add the audio clip, which would be the C Alex Productions again. So this holds some information about something that we wanted. This scriptable object has that variable filled in for us, so we can use that at any point that we want. For our radio controller, we had a way to play, pause, stop, and all those things, but we might wanted multiple tracks that we want to play. I've just added some headers to make it easier to read. But we're going to add a list or an array of tracks that we've predetermined that will be able to be played. So we'll have square brackets serialized field. I'm going to have private, and then I'm going to reference my scriptable object, which was called track. So I'll call track. I'll put square brackets after it to declare the array. And then I'm just going to have this as audio tracks with a semicolon, because these are the things that we're going to have a list of or an array of to control what's going to happen. Then we need to actually be able to update our UI. So we have another square brackets private text, but we need to use a namespace at the top to reference UIs in Unity. So we'll say using Unity engine.ui, and then with the private text, we'll say that this is the track text UI, which we're only going to reference one. And then at the top, we might want to put these together with the actual array that we're going to create. We'll call this private integer, and we're just going to set a track index. It's so we can keep an eye on which track we're actually on based on the index number that the array has, because if the array holds 5 different items, it'll be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that'll be 5 indexed tracks in the array. So in our start method below here, what we can say is that our track index should start and equal 0, because that's just the first one in the actual track, because remember array starts at 0. So we want to actually give the audio source a specific clip that once it's ready to play, it will play that clip. So we'll say that radio audio source dot clip, so the audio clip that we're going to give it, equals audio tracks, and then in square brackets track index dot track audio clip with a semicolon. So if I go through this simply, is the audio tracks is the name of our array. We're going to choose the index that we're currently on. So if we're on start, it'll be 0, so it'll be the first one in the index. And then if it's the first one in the index, it'll be one of these scriptable objects, because we've specified that it's going to be our scriptable object that we're going to use. And then we've got a public variable in the scriptable object called track audio clip, and it's going to put into the audio source that specific clip, and we can put any number into the track index if we wanted a different number to start. But that's the simplicity of it. And say you wanted to add the name of the track to that UI that we just created, we can do this in a really simple way too. So we can say track text UI dot text is equal to audio tracks, and then in square brackets again, track index, and then we can just say something dot name, and we don't need to specify dot name because it's built into the scriptable object, and it's just whatever that particular, remember we called it C-Alex Productions, that's the name of the scriptable object. So what we can do is save that. We'll go back into Unity again. I will go onto my radio. You can see my script. I'm looking for the track UI. So I'm going to go to the horizontal buttons and go to the actual track text, but the text component, add that in. And then you can see my list of tracks. It has nothing in at the moment. We can just say, we'll add one thing to our array for now. And you can see in my scriptable object, I had one called C-Alex Productions. I can add that straight in. You can see that I'll give you the example now. That on the audio source, we will remove the current track that we specified by default. So you see now, there's track name, there is nothing in the audio source, but we expect that when we press play, this will become updated, and this will also become updated by the thing that we entered. So we press play, and you can see that the C by Alex Productions was added, and you can see that the name also updated, and you could, of course, make the text smaller or increase the size of this box if you wanted it to fit better. So now that that's in there, if we press the play button, it would play that audio. In our next bit of scripting, we want to be able to make the skip buttons work. So how do we go about doing that? So I'm going to write a public void and then call this our skip forward button, 2 brackets and 2 curly brackets below. Now when we press that button, we want to just skip the audio track. So if we imagine to do that, our index started at 0, didn't we? If we want to get to the next track in the array, we just could add 1. So what we could do is realistically, every time we press that button, we'll say track index ++ with a semicolon. So that means the track index, it'll just increment it by 1. Then what we need to do is be able to update what our audio source has in that clip slot. Remember, like we did in the start method up here. But we can create ourselves a method because we're going to skip forward and we're going to skip backwards. So we want just a method to control that without us having to rewrite the same amount of code. So I'm just going to create a method below there and call it update track. And then we're just going to give it an integer, and we're going to give this just a default parameter, which is going to be whatever index we feed to it is whatever we should update. So now in this case, the track index here is ++. Now we'll do the update track, and then we're just going to feed into that the track index of what we've just incremented. So that means that once we pass it, and track index is an integer anyway. So once we press update track index, it will call this and it will fill this just small index, which is in our method, and it's already an integer, so we can use this within the method. So now we can say that our radio audio source dot clip, as we did above in the start method, equals audio tracks, and then in square brackets we could use this track index, but seeing as we've passed it into this method, we can just use the parameter of index, and then we can say track audio clip with a semicolon, and then again we can do the track text UI dot text is equal to audio tracks, and then in square brackets index again, then we can say dot name with a semicolon. And then what we can do is also, while we're here, is we'll create public void skip backwards button, add 2 curly brackets below. We'll say track index minus minus this time with a semicolon, and then again we'll do update track and we'll just say the track index again. So in a sense it will just update the clip depending on which way we go, and then update the name exactly as we want. So now we can minimize, go back into Unity again. We can select on our backwards button. It's already got the on-click event because I duplicated another button, but you can add an event if it doesn't. You select the radio controller again, and then we can just say that we want to skip backwards. Then we'll select the forward button, and again, radio controller, skip forwards. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the scriptable objects I have, because I don't need to right click and create. I can just now add a few more pieces of audio. So I'm just going to copy silence, metro, vice, copy that in here, make sure that I add that to my scriptable object, and I'm just going to off screen just add all these to my scriptable objects just by renaming them and then adding them to the audio clip slot. And now once we've got a bunch of scriptable objects which just hold different audio tracks, we can select back on our radio. I'm going to minus the audio source, and I'm just going to add, I'm going to have 5 different tracks. So you can see them here. We've got the different things that we need, so I can just add them in incrementally. So now I've added them all to those slots. If I just press play, we expect to have C, Alex Productions, Silence, Sunset, Travel With Us. So if we press play, so we have C Productions, we can stop. We have Silence by Metro Vice. Skip on every time we skip, it should stop the audio. Press play on all the different things, pause, stop, play. We're still going to look at adding an audio slider to be able to fade the tracks, and then making sure that we can't go back too many times or forward if we've got no more tracks to load in. So what we can do now is we can go and create ourselves an audio slider. So we can right click on the radio canvas, go UI and choose slider. So my slider has been created now. I'm going to rename this to volume slider. You can see it here. I don't really like how the default one looks. So what I usually like to do, delete the handle. I get the handle area and I'll just scale this all the way to the ends. Then in the fill area, I push that all the way to the end as well. Then in the fill, it's just the picture of this little circle. I grab this and I scale this all the way down just so you can't almost see it anymore. So it's completely flat. Now if I select the full audio slider like this and I just scale it up, I can just put it slightly above my object like this. You can see it goes from 0 to 1, and now you can see what you can do is select the background and just make this a little bit grayer, just like the ones below, and reduce the opacity slightly. And then when we select back on the volume slider, you can see that it matches, and we'll leave it all the way at 1 because the volume is at maximum when we start. We could control what our audio slider does, and also be able to make sure that we can't go too far forward or back when we've got our array. So below the track update, what we'll do is we'll add a public void. So to control the audio volume, we'll do public void audio volume. Then in brackets, I'll say float and just have a local parameter. Just have a parameter of float volume. Then I'm going to say that the radio audio source is what we're going to set. The audio source dot volume equals the volume that we've set when we adjust that slider from 0 and 1. So that's as simple as it is. We will do that when we go back into Unity again. Now what we want to do is for our backwards button, we want to be able to make an if statement. So then when we press it and say there isn't any to go backwards to, say we're at the start, we don't want to be able to go back from there. So what we can say is that we can only go backwards if the track index is greater than or equal to 1. Because then we should be able to go back to 0, because we never want to go below or we'll get an error and we'll break it. So the track index, as long as it's greater than or equal to 1, we'll be able to go backwards. If not, we can't. So now we want to create the skip forward button. We need to check that if our track index is less than the audio tracks dot length with a capital, which is the full length of the array, minus 1, because we never want to get to the end of the array, we want to always make sure that we can't. We'll encapsulate this with 2 curly brackets. So we can go back into Unity, we can go into our volume slider, add an onChanged event, go to the radio controller and add the dynamic float, which is radio volume. Now what we can do is when we press play, you can see that we have Alex Productions. We try and go back. We can't because it doesn't change anything. We can still press play. We can make the audio quieter. We can skip on, press play again, pause, play. We can skip all the way to the last track, which was Wanderlust. And then we can play that track, stop it, pause it, and do whatever, so we can never get to the end and manage to break it. Now there's one last thing that we want to do, is be able to actually fade each of these audios in and out, depending on if we click it, because it's a bit abrupt if it just stops really awkwardly. So at the bottom here, at the bottom of my methods that I've got, I'm going to have a public enumerator, which will be we're going to create a coroutine to make sure that it does it. And as soon as that's finished, then we can do some other stuff. So then we're going to say fade out. And then as a parameter, we'll just say that the audio source is going to be the audio source that we're going to pass into it. Float fade time, which is how long it's going to take before it fades out. So then we're going to add 2 curly brackets below there and say that float start volume is equal to the audio source that we're going to pass into it, which is the local reference to the parameter here, dot volume. So it's whatever that audio source that we passed into is current volume at that given time. Then we're going to create a while loop. So if we say that if anything, while something is true, we need to do something else. So while the audio source that we've passed into with a lowercase, dot volume is greater than 0. So if it's greater than 0, it's obviously got some volume left. We're going to say that the audio source that we've passed into, dot volume minus equals the start volume times by time dot delta time divided by the fade time. So it's just going to take away from the start volume in real time in a delta time divided by the time that it takes for that to happen. And then under here we can just write yield return null, because once it's finished we want to just return back. Then what we need to make sure that once this is finished, we need to make sure that audio source dot stop as, actually we'll just call this just to make sure that nothing happens. And then under here we need to actually make sure that because we could have actually set the audio volume before we faded out, we need to actually make sure that we remember what it was on when we go to play the next track. So we need to say that audio source dot volume is equal to whatever the volume was originally after we've stopped it, just to make sure that, say you'd half the volume, when you skip the track and you press play, you want to keep the volume at half because you don't want it to go back to 1 and break what program we have. Then we can call the method update track, and we can just call this the track index again. So in this case, it's the skip forward. We can remove that update track because we've just put it in the one below. Now we're going to start coroutine, because if we skip forward, we're going to fade out. We'll say fade out, and then in brackets, we'll say that the radio audio source is the audio source that we're going to give to that method. And then we'll say we'll fade out over 0.5 seconds, and then add a semicolon. So as soon as we skip, we're going to increment the track index. We're going to play this or start this coroutine. Now we're going to do something very similar for fading in. So we're going to below create a public enumerator again, set it to fade in, open up the brackets and have this as audio source, have this as the lowercase audio source that we're going to create, have float fade time again, then add 2 curly brackets, and then we'll say that float start volume is equal to our audio source dot volume again. Then what we need to make sure that in this instance, that we need to make sure that audio source dot volume is equal to 0, because remember we kept the audio source's volume as soon as we fade in, just to make sure that we always have it. But in this case, because we want to fade in at this point, the audio source's volume has to be 0 at this point. And then what we could do is audio source dot play, because we're going to play the audio after it's faded in. And then we'll also say that while that the audio source dot volume is less than the start volume of which we captured, we'll say that the audio source dot volume plus equals the start volume times by time dot delta time divided by our fade time again. And then we can say yield return null, and then under here we'll say that our audio source dot volume is then equal to our start volume, so we can have the original volume that we might have set. Now, in case of our object which it skips, we can just copy our start routine and we can add that down below. So then what you can do is you can add the same start coroutine to the skip and the forward and the backwards, which is going to fade out. But then what you want to also do is on the play button, we want to now remove the play audio source, and we want to then change this to fade in. So we want to start the coroutine and play the audio as only when it fades in. And essentially we could add the same thing to the stop. So instead of stopping, when we press stop, we can add the fade. So let me run through this really quickly whilst we've got everything together. So we've got our start method, which finds the audio source. We get a track index. We find the current track that we want to play and update the text. And we don't play unless we specify. The skip button checks to see if we're towards the end. We do -1 just so we can never get to the end. Then we'll update the track index and play a fade. And we'll pass in the radio audio source and a 0.5 second fade out time. And now we'll skip backwards and we'll fade out, and we'll be able to update the track. Based on when we've pressed fade out, we will update the track and change the volumes. We can change the volume control. We can play audio by fading in. We can pause the audio by just playing audio source.pause. We can stop the audio by fading out again. And fade out is a coroutine control what we've got the volume at the start, to be able to control whether our volume is greater than 0, and we'll fade out if it isn't. And then we'll stop it, set the start volume, and then update the track. And if we need to fade in, we'll get the start volume again, fade in from 0, and then set the original volume. So now what we can do is we can test this out. And I'll just turn the volume down, press play, and you get a simple fade in. I can skip across, it'll fade out, press play again, it will fade in, press stop, it will fade out, skip again, and then I can go backwards and play and do whatever I need to. And as you can see here, I've just extended the visuals of it by creating a little particle effect of musical notes which come out when you press it, and you can set these particles to play or pause, and I could make a tutorial on how to make these little particles if you want. So I hope this helped you out, and you can create yourself a simple little radio or music control system to be able to skip, play, pause, and create some cool effects in there. So let me know if you like this tutorial. Give me any tips if you want to improve this. I'll put it all on my Patreon so you can check out all the scripts, all the project files, and everything. So be sure to come and join me on Discord. Check out my great assets on the Unity store, and thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Cheers.